The snow had stopped falling 3 hours ago, but Oskar Lindgren's cabin was already buried under 9 feet of it. While his neighbors suffocated in their sealed log prisons or froze trying to dig through walls of powder, Oskar crawled on his hands and knees through a stone-lined tunnel that no one had believed he would ever need. Before we continue, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and if you want more stories of frontier ingenuity that saved lives, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more incredible. The cabin felt smaller every hour. Oskar Lindgren pressed his hand against the door and felt the pressure from the other side, tons of snow packed against the wood like a living thing trying to get in, or maybe trying to keep them inside. He couldn't tell anymore. The fire in the stone hearth was burning low, and Raymond Cooper sat near it, coughing into his hand. It was February 18th, 1846. They were 3 days into a blizzard that had turned the Wind River Range of Wyoming Territory into a white hell. The cabin that had seemed sturdy when they'd built it the previous summer now felt like a coffin with the lid slowly closing. "We need more wood," Raymond said, his voice hoarse. The coughing had started yesterday. Oskar knew what it meant. The air inside the cabin was going bad. Too much smoke, not enough fresh air coming in. Every gap in the walls was sealed with snow. The window was buried. The door wouldn't budge against the weight pressing from outside. Oskar had tried that morning, putting his shoulder into it until his muscles screamed. The door had moved maybe 2 inches before the wall of snow pushed back. He'd seen the darkness through that tiny gap, snow packed so tightly it might as well have been earth. They were buried alive in a cabin that still had walls and a roof. "I'll break through the roof," Oskar said. He'd been thinking about it all day. It was madness, letting cold air pour in, when they were already struggling to stay warm. But the alternative was suffocating slowly in smoke and depleted air. Raymond shook his head. "Snow's too deep. You saw it. Must be 6-7 feet up there by now. You break through, and it'll pour in. We'll freeze before we can dig out. We'll freeze anyway if we can't breathe. Then we burn less, make the wood last." They burned less. The temperature inside the cabin dropped. Raymond's coughing got worse. Oskar watched his partner through the dim light of their dying fire and understood with horrible clarity that they'd made a fundamental mistake. They'd built a shelter designed to keep weather out, but they hadn't built one designed to let them escape when the weather became the walls themselves. On the 4th day, Raymond stopped coughing. Oskar was hauling wood from their small interior stack when he noticed the silence. He turned and saw Raymond slumped near the hearth, his face peaceful, his chest still. Carbon monoxide? Probably. The smoke and bad air had taken him quietly while Oskar's back was turned. Oskar sat beside his partner's body for an hour, maybe more. Time felt strange in the dim, airless cabin. Then survival instinct overrode grief. He had to get out. He climbed to the loft and began tearing at the roof. Spring came slowly to the Wind River Range. Oskar spent the weeks after Raymond's death in a fog of grief and obsessive thinking. He'd survived his own roof-breaking escape by pure luck, clawing through snow until his hands bled, emerging into frozen air that burned his lungs but kept him alive. Raymond hadn't been so fortunate. The thaw in April revealed his partner's body exactly where Oskar had left it, preserved by cold. Oskar buried Raymond on a hillside overlooking the valley where they'd trapped together for 2 seasons. He marked the grave with stones and spent that night unable to sleep, his mind circling the same question: how many other men had died the same way? He began traveling to abandoned cabins throughout the territory. The evidence was everywhere once he knew to look for it. A cabin near the Green River had its door broken outward, splintered wood showing where someone had tried desperately to escape from inside. The snow had melted months ago, but Oskar could read the story. Someone trapped, someone who'd thrown themselves against the door until the wood gave way, only to face a wall of packed snow that wouldn't yield. Another cabin showed a collapsed section of roof. Oskar climbed inside and found the interior destroyed by snow that had poured through the opening. Scattered belongings suggested the occupant had fled, but there was no way to know if they'd survived the escape into a blizzard. At a trading post near South Pass, he met a trapper named Leonard Foster, who'd survived the same storm that killed Raymond. Foster described being sealed in his cabin for 5 days, burning everything that would catch fire, including part of his door frame, just to stay warm and keep air moving. "Thought I was dead," Foster said, drinking whiskey with shaking hands. "Could feel the air going thick, started seeing things that weren't there. Then the storm broke, and I dug out through the window. Took me 8 hours to clear enough snow to squeeze through." Oskar asked how many others had survived. Foster's expression went dark. "Charlie Brennan didn't make it, found him in May, and the Hutchison brothers, nobody's seen them since January. Their cabin's still standing, but I'm guessing they're inside it." Every conversation revealed the same pattern. Mountain men accepted cabin burial as a risk of winter trapping, like bear attacks or avalanches. It was simply how things were. You built a cabin, you hoped the snow didn't get too deep, and if it did, you either got lucky or you didn't. Oskar realized something that spring that changed everything. The problem wasn't that cabins failed. The problem was that every cabin had only one way out. When that single exit became blocked, the cabin transformed from shelter into tomb. He began sketching in his journal underground passages, tunnels, secondary exits built into hillsides, ways to move beneath the snow instead of through it. When other trappers saw his drawings, they laughed. Chester Boone looked at Oskar's sketches and shook his head. "Planning to dig like a badger, Lindgren? Just build your cabin better." Oskar left the mountains in early June 1846, heading to Fort Bridger with his spring furs. Most trappers spent their town time drinking, gambling, and forgetting the isolation of wilderness life. Oskar spent his watching people build things. Fort Bridger was growing. Mormon settlers were moving through on their way to the Salt Lake Valley, and some were staying to establish permanent structures. Oskar watched a crew laying foundation stones for a supply warehouse. He stood for hours observing how they selected rocks, how they fitted irregular shapes into stable walls, how they created corners that locked together without mortar. The foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Thomas Shepard, eventually noticed him. "You planning to help or just supervise?" "Learning," Oskar said simply. "How much weight can a stone wall like that hold?" Shepard looked at him with new interest. "Done right? More than you'd think. Stone handles compression better than wood. You can stack weight on it all day long, and it just sits there. Long as the foundation's solid and the walls plumb, it'll hold whatever you put on top." Oskar asked about spans and supports. Shepard explained how wooden beams distributed weight across stone walls, how arches created strength, how thickness mattered more than height for load-bearing. He drew diagrams in the dirt, explaining principles he'd learned as a stonemason in Pennsylvania before heading west. Oskar spent 2 days helping with the foundation in exchange for knowledge. He learned which stones made good, base layers, how to identify weaknesses in rock that would crack under pressure, how to create walls that leaned slightly inward for stability. He asked about underground construction. "Root cellars?" Shepard said. "Built dozens back east. Trick is keeping them from collapsing. Stone walls, timber ceiling supports, and enough earth above to insulate. They never freeze in winter, never get hot in summer, and they don't cave in because the stone walls hold the earth back." Oskar absorbed every detail. He visited the fort's mine operation and studied how they reinforced tunnel entrances. He examined root cellars behind settler cabins and noted the construction methods. He bought whiskey for an old trapper who'd worked in coal mines before coming west and listened to stories about shaft construction and ceiling supports. By the time he left Fort Bridger in late July, Oskar had filled 20 pages of his journal with drawings and notes. He returned to the mountains with unusual supplies: 3 iron chisels for working stone, a specialized adze for shaping timber, and rolls of heavy canvas he'd paid too much for but knew he'd need. Other trappers noticed. Harlan Pritchard saw Oskar's pack train arriving and rode over to investigate. "Building a fort, Lindgren? That's mining equipment and mason tools." "Building something," Oskar replied, not elaborating. "Must be planning to stay a while." Most of us just need a cabin. Most of us just need to stay alive, Oskar said quietly, thinking of Raymond's grave on the hillside. Oskar selected his new cabin site in early September, 1846. The location wasn't chosen for convenience or proximity to beaver streams. He chose it for terrain. The spot sat on a hillside with a natural slope rising behind it, elevated enough for drainage but protected from wind by the rise of land. Most importantly, the hillside was composed of stable earth, not loose scree or rock that would make excavation impossible. He built the cabin first, but differently than most mountain men. He positioned it with the rear wall tight against the rising slope, almost built into the hillside itself. The cabin itself was standard construction, logs notched at corners, a stone hearth, a solid door. But beneath the floor, he left a crawl space 2 feet high instead of setting logs directly on the ground. That crawl space would matter later. Then he began the real work. 20 feet downslope from the cabin, at a point where the hillside met flat ground, Oskar marked out a rectangle 36 inches wide and 30 inches high. He started digging. The excavation required removing earth 1 shovelful at a time from a space barely large enough to turn around in. Oskar worked on his knees, digging horizontally into the hillside. He'd built a small wooden sledge to drag earth out of the tunnel as it deepened. Every foot of progress meant hauling out approximately 40 cubic feet of soil and rock. He dug upward at a slight angle, aiming for the point where his tunnel would intersect the crawl space beneath his cabin floor. The geometry had to be exact. Too steep, and the tunnel would be difficult to crawl through. Too shallow, and it wouldn't reach the cabin. He used a plumb line and level he'd purchased at Fort Bridger, checking his angle every few feet. The work was brutally slow. Roots had to be cut and removed. Rocks had to be pried loose. The tunnel had to maintain consistent dimensions as it progressed. Oskar worked from dawn until dark, emerging each evening covered in dirt, his shoulders aching from the confined space. Chester Boone visited in late September and found Oskar hauling another sledge load of earth from the hillside. "What in God's name are you doing, Lindgren?" "Digging," Oskar said, dumping the dirt and heading back in. Boone peered into the dark entrance. "Digging to where?" "That's not a root cellar. That's going sideways into the hill." "Yes?" "You digging for gold or sanity?" "Because I don't. Think you'll find either in there." Oskar didn't respond. He was already crawling back into the tunnel with his shovel. Behind him, he heard Boone mutter something about grief making men crazy, then the sound of a horse riding away. By mid-October, the tunnel extended 18 feet into the hillside. Oskar's measurements told him he was now directly beneath his cabin, approximately 8 feet below the floor level. He dug upward carefully, breaking through into the crawl space he'd left beneath the cabin floor. The connection was complete. He could now enter the tunnel downslope and emerge inside his cabin's foundation. With the tunnel excavated, Oskar began the work that would define whether his system lived or died under snow pressure. The bare earth tunnel would collapse eventually. Moisture would soften walls. Freeze and thaw cycles would crack the ceiling. He needed stone. He found his material 2 miles east at a creek bed where centuries of water flow had deposited flat, field stones in endless supply. The stones were dark gray slate, naturally fractured into pieces, ranging from the size of his hand to slabs 3 feet across. Oskar selected obsessively. He rejected round stones, irregular shapes, anything that wouldn't stack cleanly. He wanted flat surfaces that would nest together. He built a sledge specifically for hauling stone. Each trip to the creek took 4 hours round trip. He could carry perhaps 200 pounds of stone per load. He made that journey 43 times over the next 6 weeks. The wall construction began at the tunnel entrance and progressed inward. Oskar worked on his back and sides in the cramped space, fitting stones together like puzzle pieces. He built the walls 18 inches thick, knowing they had to bear enormous lateral pressure from earth and snow above. Each stone was placed to interlock with those around it, creating a structure where force on one stone distributed across multiple connection points. The walls rose 3 feet high from the tunnel floor, following the passage's full 18-foot length. He left approximately 27 inches of clearance between the wall tops, enough for him to crawl through on hands and knees with a small pack. At the corners where walls met the tunnel entrance, he created especially robust joints, using large capstones to lock everything together. Without mortar, the walls relied entirely on friction and weight. Oskar used clay from the creek bank to fill hairline gaps, packing it into spaces where stones didn't quite meet. The clay wouldn't provide structural strength, but it would seal against drafts and moisture. The work destroyed his hands. Stone edges cut through calluses. His fingernails cracked and bled. His back seized from hours spent contorted in the narrow space. But the walls grew steadily. Stone fitted to stone, creating a passage that looked ancient and permanent despite being only weeks old. By late October, the stone walls extended, from entrance to the point where the tunnel met his cabin's crawl space. He'd built a small opening in the final wall section, creating an access point into the cabin's foundation. A wooden cover would seal it from inside when not in use. Harlan Pritchard stopped by during the final days of wall construction and stared at the stone-lined entrance. "That's a month of work for a hole in the ground, Lindgren. You could have trapped 3 valleys in the time you've spent on this." Oskar set another stone carefully before responding. "Raymond and I trapped 5 valleys. Didn't help him much when the snow came." Pritchard had no answer to that. He rode away without another word, leaving Oskar to his stones and silence. The roof system would determine whether Oskar's tunnel was a survival tool or an elaborate grave. Stone walls could bear tremendous weight, but they needed something to span the gap between them, something that would support tons of snow without collapsing into the passage below. Oskar spent 3 days selecting trees. He needed lodgepole pine, straight-grained and dense, approximately 8 to 10 inches in diameter. He found them 2 miles north, cut 23 trees, and limbed them carefully. Each log had to be exactly 6 feet 3 inches long to span the tunnel width with 3 inches of bearing surface on each stone wall. He used his adze to shape the log ends, creating flat surfaces that would sit solidly on the stone walls. The work required precision. Uneven bearing would concentrate weight on single points and crack the stone. He shaped each log end until it sat perfectly level across its full width. Starting at the tunnel entrance, Oskar laid the first beam across the stone walls. It settled into place with satisfying solidity. He positioned the next beam 16 inches away, then another. The spacing was critical. Too far apart and the roof covering would sag between beams. Too close together and he'd waste wood better used elsewhere. The beams created a ribbed structure over the full 18-foot tunnel length. From inside, looking up, the passage resembled the hull of an upside-down boat, wooden ribs spanning stone walls in regular intervals. Over the beams, Oskar stretched elk hides he'd prepared during autumn hunting. He'd taken 7 elk specifically for their hides, tanning them with a mixture of brain matter and wood ash until they were flexible and durable. He laid the hides lengthwise over the beams, overlapping edges by 6 inches, securing them with wooden pegs driven into the beam sides. The hide layer served multiple purposes. It created a vapor barrier, keeping moisture from rotting the wood above. It added insulation value. Most importantly, it provided flexibility. Snow weight would compress and shift. Rigid materials would crack. The hides would flex and distribute pressure. Over the hides came moss. Oskar had gathered it from north-facing slopes where it grew thick and dense. He packed it 6 inches deep over the entire hide surface, creating an insulation layer that would keep the tunnel interior above freezing even when surface temperatures dropped to -30 degrees. The final layer was sod and turf. Oskar cut rectangular sections from the hillside above, preserving the root systems. He laid them grass-side up over the moss, rebuilding the natural slope. The living plants would root and grow, creating a permanent seal that would look like undisturbed hillside. When finished, the tunnel was invisible from above. The roof system added approximately 18 inches of material over the beams. Total depth from stone floor to hillside surface was roughly 6 feet. Oskar tested the structure by piling stones on top, simulating snow load. He added weight until the equivalent of 8 feet of heavy snow pressed down. The beams didn't flex. The stone walls didn't shift. The first snow came on December 14th, 1846. Oskar woke to find 3 feet of powder, covering everything. The world transformed overnight into white silence. He dressed in heavy furs and went outside, not through his cabin door, but through the test he'd been anticipating for months. He descended into the crawl space beneath his cabin floor, moving carefully in the confined darkness. His hand found the wooden cover he'd built over the tunnel access. He pulled it aside and crawled forward into absolute blackness. The tunnel was tight and cold. Oskar moved on hands and knees, his shoulders nearly brushing stone walls on either side. He couldn't see anything, navigating by touch and memory. The stone was rough under his palms, his breath echoed strangely in the confined space. 20 feet of crawling through darkness. Then his hands found the change in air temperature that meant he was nearing the entrance. He emerged at the downslope, opening into blinding white daylight. Snow had drifted around the entrance but hadn't blocked it. The low profile kept it below the main. Accumulation. Oskar stood and looked back at his cabin, barely visible through falling snow. He'd just proven the system worked. He could exit his cabin even with 3 feet of snow covering the normal door. He spent that day practicing. He crawled through the tunnel a dozen times, learning its dimensions in darkness, memorizing where the walls narrowed slightly, where a protruding stone required him to shift left. He cached firewood near the exterior entrance, stacking split logs under a canvas cover anchored with rocks. By late December, 6 feet of snow covered the hillside. The tunnel entrance remained accessible, though Oskar had to dig out a small area around it each morning. The cabin door was buried. His window showed nothing but white. Anyone depending on conventional exits would be trapped. Oskar came and went as he pleased, crawling through his stone passage whenever he needed firewood, fresh air, or simply to prove he could. Other trappers wintered in valleys within riding distance. Word spread about Oskar's tunnel. Some thought it clever, most thought it excessive. Harlan Pritchard visited during a clear spell in early January, riding through snow that came to his horse's chest. He examined the tunnel entrance, now just a dark opening in an otherwise featureless white slope. "That's a month of work for something you'll never really need, Lindgren," Pritchard said, his breath fogging in air cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. "Cabin doors work just fine. You just dig them out when snow gets high." Oskar looked at him steadily. Raymond Cooper thought so too. Pritchard's expression shifted uncomfortably. He changed the subject to beaver prices and rode away an hour later. Oskar watched him go, then crawled back through his tunnel to the warm cabin above, carrying an armload of firewood that no buried door could have prevented him from accessing. The blizzard arrived on January 9th, 1847, with a temperature drop that made the air feel solid. Oskar was checking his trap lines when the wind shifted and the sky turned the color of old iron. He knew what was coming. Every instinct honed over 8 winters in the mountains told him to get inside immediately. He made it to his cabin an hour before the snow started. When it began, it fell like the sky was collapsing. By nightfall, visibility dropped to arm's length. The wind howled with a sound like animals screaming. Snow didn't fall so much as materialize from every direction at once. Oskar sat by his fire and listened to the storm trying to dismantle the world. The cabin walls groaned under wind pressure. Snow built against the door with audible weight. By morning, the window showed only white. By afternoon, darkness crept in as snow covered the glass completely. He was sealed inside. The blizzard continued. Day 2 brought no break in snowfall. Oskar's firewood supply inside the cabin began dwindling. More concerning, the air grew thick. Smoke from his fire hung heavy despite the chimney. He recognized the signs. The cabin was becoming airtight as snow sealed every gap. His fire was consuming oxygen faster than fresh air could enter. He let the fire burn down to coals and descended into his crawl space. The tunnel access was exactly where he'd left it. He crawled through darkness, counting the distance by memory. Stone walls guided him forward. The passage seemed longer in pitch blackness, but his hands eventually found the temperature change that meant he was nearing the entrance. The exterior opening was partially drifted shut. Oskar dug outward, clearing enough space to emerge into the storm. The world outside was chaos. Wind-driven snow made breathing difficult. The cold was vicious, -30 degrees or worse. But the air was fresh and clean, and Oskar's firewood cache was right where he'd left it. He loaded his canvas pack with split logs and crawled back through the tunnel. The trip took 10 minutes each way. He emerged in his cabin with enough wood for 3 days and lungs full of clean air. His tunnel had just done exactly what he'd built it to do. The storm continued through day 3. Oskar used his tunnel twice more, hauling firewood and clearing the entrance for ventilation. Each time he crawled through, he marveled at the stone walls holding firm under what must be tremendous snow weight above. On day 4, the snow finally stopped. Silence settled over the mountains like a blanket. Oskar crawled through his tunnel one more time and emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. Snow covered everything to depths he'd never seen. His cabin was buried under at least 9 feet, only the peak of the roof visible. Drifts rose 20 feet against hillsides. The landscape looked like an ocean, frozen mid-wave. The silence after the storm was worse than the howling had been. Oskar stood outside his tunnel entrance in air so cold it burned to breathe and looked across a landscape that no longer resembled the mountains he knew. Everything was buried. Trees were white mounds. Valleys had filled and flattened. His cabin showed only as a slight rise in the snow, the roof peak barely visible like a dorsal fin breaking water. He needed to check on his neighbors. Chester Boone's cabin was 3 miles east. Leonard Foster trapped 4 miles south. Harlan Pritchard had wintered in a valley 6 miles north. Oskar strapped on snowshoes and began the trek to Boone's place. The journey took 5 hours through snow that would have been impossible without snowshoes. When he arrived, Boone's cabin looked untouched, peaceful under its blanket of white. Oskar called out. No response. He began digging at where the door should be, clearing snow until he hit wood. The door wouldn't open. He put his shoulder into it and felt resistance, then sudden give. The door swung inward. Chester Boone was slumped against the far wall, his face peaceful, his skin the color of old parchment, dead. Probably carbon monoxide poisoning from a fire in a sealed cabin, the same way Raymond had died. Oskar stood in the doorway for a long moment, then closed it gently and continued south toward Foster's place. Leonard Foster was alive, but barely. Oskar found him outside his cabin, or what remained of it. Part of the roof had collapsed under snow weight. Foster had attempted to dig out through the door and gotten trapped in a snow tunnel that collapsed on him. He'd spent 18 hours buried before managing to claw his way to the surface. His hands were black with frostbite. His face showed the haunted look of a man who'd felt death breathing on his neck. "Oskar," Foster said, his voice cracking. "How are you even here? How did you get out?" "I walked," Oskar said simply. "You need to come back to my cabin. Your hands need treatment. Your cabin's buried like everyone else's. How did you get out?" "I built a tunnel, underground. Goes from my cabin to a point downslope. I crawl out, underneath the snow." Foster stared at him. "You built that before the storm?" "Last fall. After Raymond died, I decided I wouldn't die the same way. They found Harlan Pritchard 2 days later. He'd survived, but just barely. His cabin had held, but he'd been sealed inside for 4 days, burning furniture to stay warm, nearly dying from bad air. When Oskar showed him the tunnel system, Pritchard's skepticism vanished. "Can you help me build one?" "Yes," Oskar said. By spring, Leonard Foster and Harlan Pritchard both had stone-lined crawl tunnels leading from their cabins. The innovation that had saved Oskar's life was spreading. Other trappers heard the stories of who survived and how. The man who'd been mocked for digging like a badger had discovered something the frontier desperately needed. A way to survive what had always been unsurvivable. Spring came to the Wind River Range in late April, 1847, melting the evidence of the storm that had rewritten survival rules for everyone who lived through it. By May, 5 trappers in the territory were excavating tunnels using Oskar's techniques. Word spread through the informal network that connected isolated mountain men across hundreds of miles of wilderness. A trapper named William Crane visited from the Montana Territory in June, heard about the tunnel systems, and asked Oskar to explain the construction. Oskar spent 2 days showing him the stone wall technique, the log and hide roof system, the crawl height dimensions that kept entrances below snow burial depth. Crane returned north and built his own tunnel that summer. By 1850, crawl tunnel systems were appearing throughout the high snow regions of the Rocky Mountains. Variations developed as men adapted Oskar's core principles to different terrain and available materials. Some trappers built tunnels to firewood caches stored in hillside caves. Others created passages to spring houses or meat storage areas. A few ambitious builders constructed multiple tunnels radiating from their cabins like spokes, providing several emergency exits. But all followed Oskar's fundamental design: stone walls for strength, log beam roofs for span, hide and moss layers for insulation, and crawl height profiles that stayed accessible when surface structures disappeared under snow. The techniques spread organically, shared freely between men who understood that survival knowledge belonged to everyone. The winter of 1856 brought another catastrophic blizzard to the northern Rockies. Snow fell for 6 days straight across Montana and Wyoming territories. When it ended, 17 men were confirmed alive, specifically because they'd maintained access to resources through their tunnel systems. 3 of those men had never met Oskar Lindgren. They'd learned the technique from someone who'd learned it from someone else, the knowledge passing through the community like a life-saving contagion. Oskar himself left the mountains in 1858. He was 33 years old, had survived 11 winters in the wilderness, and had saved enough money to start a different life. He sold his cabin and trap lines to a young trapper from Pennsylvania and rode west to the Salt Lake Valley. He bought farmland near the Jordan River, built a house with a proper foundation, and married a widow named Sarah Mitchell in 1860. They had 2 children, a son and a daughter, who would never know the mountain man life their father had lived. Oskar became a farmer, a quiet man who attended church and raised crops, and rarely spoke about his years in the high country. But in the mountains he'd left behind, his tunnels remained. Some were maintained by new owners. Others were abandoned as the fur trade collapsed and trappers moved on. A few were discovered by homesteaders and prospectors who recognized superior engineering when they saw it and wondered who had built such things. The phrase, "built a Lindgren tunnel," entered the vocabulary of high country survival. It meant serious preparation, refusing to accept that traditional methods were the only methods, understanding that the worst could happen, and building infrastructure before it did. Oskar Lindgren died in 1883 at age 68 on his farm in Utah Territory. His obituary in the Deseret News mentioned his farming success and his service to the community. It said nothing about the stone-lined passages carved into Rocky Mountain hillsides, nothing about the crawl tunnels that saved lives he never knew about in storms he never witnessed. His legacy wasn't carved in stone monuments or written in history books. It was built into hillsides across the frontier, one carefully fitted stone at a time, standing silent testament to what knowledge and determination could accomplish when a man refused to die the way his partner had. The impossible had become routine, and survival had become a matter of engineering rather than luck.